Well, hello, Professor, and this is my final focus inquiry project. As you know, I am presenting this on how Wally relates to Kupperman's six myths on the good life. And so, to start, like you say, at the beginning of my presentation, I have to explain and reflect on what is a myth. Sorry, I thought I heard someone coming. Um, so, a myth is a widely held belief system, or just belief, singular belief, that is largely not questioned. And so I think that can range from like cultural misconceptions, sort of like, you know, don't uh, don't eat before swimming, um, and also like this sort of gets into like the satanic panic, like basically stories that 80s kids were taught that like were sort of like cautionary tales. I think the most common forms of myths that have been passed down generation to generation, including to our own, have been these sort of 80s era cautionary tales where parents were overly cautious and overly paranoid about their kids' whereabouts. So I think the Satanic Panic was definitely a widespread myth that was very widely believed. And then you sort of get into stranger danger, and I think that one, it's not entirely a myth, but it's an over exaggeration of this myth that you know that kids all over the country, so many kids every single day were being swooped up by white vans promising free candy. I think it was a few small cases that were just overly extrapolated out in order to make this myth that all strangers are, therefore dangerous. And so I think that is what a myth is in general. It is a misconception that is then extrapolated to become something so fantastical or so overly exaggerated in a bad way. And so how do I succeed in distinguishing a myth from an intriguing I'm reading your words here just to understand if that's all right. But how do I succeed in distinguishing a myth from an intriguing or compelling story or narrative? This is a really hard, open-ended question, and I've sort of spent quite a bit of time pondering about it. And I think, sort of like what I was saying earlier, I think it is pretty easy to tell what is a myth, as in a widely held belief that seems just too fantastical or too evil, too like sinister to be true. And so that's why I think the Satanic Panic um, sort of qualifies as being just a myth that I could see why some people believed it, because some people have very closely held faith that sort of allows them to fall into those sort of myth cycles where they just convince themselves, oh, this must be true. But I think overall, this is a difficult, open ended question to answer for me, because I haven't spent much time in my life pondering about myths. And I think, as the last 6 years or so, I've been a very media savvy person. I love to fact check. I love to do my own research. And so, and I've never really been a person of faith either. Um, so I, I would almost say I don't know in terms of how do I mean, I know how to identify myths, things that just seem either too good to be true or too sinister to be true. And so for me, the for the on the too good to be true side, this is an example I brought up before, where I talked about like sort of when I was like 5 or 6 years old, I was told about by a peer something that sounds very similar to what we've talked about in terms of the experience machine. And I was told as a little kid by a friend of mine, oh, there's this machine in the woods that can give you anything you want. And I obviously didn't find out until later it was a myth. Now, because you're gullible, and I will believe these fantastical things because it sounds fun, like because it sounds like I want it to be true, and therefore I believe it. Um, and then when it comes to an intriguing or compelling story or narrative, I can't really, I mean, because obviously myths are myths, and I think the more media literacy you get, the easier they are to identify. Um, but I can't really think of an example of how I how I distinguish myths from intriguing or stories or narratives. It's a very it's a very difficult open ended question for me to answer, like I've said, and so I think that's sort of my thoughts on it. I haven't spent much time over the course of my life thinking about it. I can definitely think about and talk about what myths are and how I identify them, but distinguishing myths from just things that are compelling, think like I honestly think like faith honestly has a lot to do with that, like because I was talking to some people today, in Monroe Park during I was talking to some people in Monroe Park about faith and how I don't have a super deep relationship with faith and how like I don't really read the Bible. And I think many things that are in the Bible are compelling stories and narratives, but I'm not a practicing Christian because I treat a lot of those stories and narratives with a healthy skepticism. I believe, as do most scholars of antiquity believe, that Jesus was real. I would say I believe that God is real, though I have no way of proving if God is a myth or if God is not a myth. There's no way of knowing. Um, and so I think that would be my 2 cents on that topic. And so now I want to get into sort of the angle I'm going at for this project, and that is how do Kupperman's myths about the good life relate to Wally? And so I wrote down, well, what are the 6 myths that he talked about? So I needed a refresher on one of them. And the first one would be his myth about the good life would be pursuing comfort and pleasure will lead to the best possible life. And so as we all know, in Wally, by and large, which is the company that controls the world, that is effectively their core message in the Pixar universe. Because by and large is not just in Wally, it's in the Pixar universe. And I went and looked at some of the By and Large commercials, and one of their quotes is, "By and Large Superstore, we've got all you need and so much more." And then the most important part is, "Happiness is what we sell. That's why everyone loves BNL." So you get a little rhyming. It kind of gets stuck in your head. It's very charming in kind of a sinister way. So that's myth number one, and how that is super clear in Wall-E, because comfort plus pleasure leads to the best possible life. That is exactly what By and Large wants its citizens to believe. Happiness is what we sell. And the only people By and Large is selling to are all the citizens of Earth, because By and Large has an 100% market share over the entire globe. And so the second myth we could look at is the desirable life equals the one that is most happy. And this is also, I think, basically could be a slogan for BNL. As we have said before, happiness is what we sell. Those are BNL's words. And they are basically literally profiting off of all human desires. And they are the ultimate monopoly and the only provider of goods and services. So they're effectively gloating out in public. We sell to you and only to you because we own the entire market share of the world. And this is where we get into his third myth. The good life requires reaching a good equilibrium, which is a point at which the important difficulties are resolved. And so, as we know, to achieve the good life, we just need to reach some unspecified happy medium where difficult tasks are all resolved. And BNL 100% propagates this myth by, saying that, oh, well, all the difficult tasks, which would be cleaning up the mess on Earth, we created. And then we say, oh, we're cleaning up the mess, so you don't have to. And so, they're just saying, well, we just got to get to this little happy place. We send all of our citizens off into space while we clean up on Earth. And that's the unspecified happy medium. Now, when I say unspecified, I don't mean like that they're not being specific enough. I just mean in terms of the mental health and the physical health of their citizens. They're just saying, oh, you'll know once you get there. Like you'll know once you get on the Axiom, you're going to be so happy. And then his fourth myth: reason rather than emotions would be the best indicator of what would be a good life. And so B&O literally says it presents itself as a voice of reason in its advertisements, and it says, quote, and never stopped expanding its efforts to make your world easier, more comfortable, and pleasant. Or, quote, by and large remains an essential and a beloved part of all of our lives, keeping you moving along life's highway, cleaning up the messes so you don't have to. So, hey, we're just cleaning up the messes so you don't have to. We are the voice of reason. And so I am running short for time here, but I also my two pieces of research. I looked at an article from Duke University, Wall-E Reflection: When Robots are Human and Humans Are Robots. I think this was a very interesting article. I'm going to put this in my submission, and I used it heavily for this assignment. It talks about how are effectively the humans in Wall-E are effectively robots. And then it's a very interesting read. And then my second piece of research would be the loss of humanity through consumerism in Wall-E. And so I think Wall-E is a perfect representation of the myths of the good life. Now, the other two myths of the good life that Kupperman covers, I couldn't quite figure out a way to apply, but I think the first four relate much more closely. And my final quote would be, I wrote this down, the days where I feel the least human are the days where I consume the most and produce the least, just like the passengers of the Axiom who are living the myth of the good life they were born into. They are brainwashed and convinced that their existence is the peak human existence, when it is the opposite of human existence, as said by the Duke article, quote, when robots are human and humans are robots. Thank you.